honor to be here for this occasion. It's a great civic occasion.
Is this working? Can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me now? Great, thank you very much. On the Bevo thing, I hope the statute of limitation has run out. I was in the library that entire time. That's what I told the Texas Rangers and the police. I know nothing about it. It's just, coincidental that Bevo showed up here. Now, I got to tell one story on this. I just heard this secondhand, so I cannot confirm what I'm going to tell you because I was in the library. But weeks after that, I heard a story that there were some gentlemen that had picked up a Longhorn coming back from Austin, just by coincidence, and somewhere between here and Austin, the DPS stopped them. And there was already a bulletin out about a Longhorn steer disappearing. One of the sensitive things is it didn't belong to the university, to TU. It belonged to a private owner. Charlie Schreiner, who I've met, and it was insured for a couple $100,000. No big deal at that time. But as the DPS guy walked around the rig and with the guys in it, he said, well, and it was closed up, what are you doing? And he said to him, well, we're moving our grandmother's furniture over to Huntsville. All of a sudden, about that time, there was a kick on the trailer that about knocked the trailer over. And the DPS officer came up to the side of the car where the driver was and put his hand up there and said, you need to be careful with that furniture, it's moving around. And on his hand was an Aggie ring. I just heard that one time at the Dixie Chicken. I can't confirm that. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. If you live here, or if you're near here, or you have anything to do with A&M, obviously the Corps is such an integral part. I think one of the greatest things on the Corps is that it does survive, it does go forward. The institution continues to grow, and I'm going to talk about the roots of this. It's kind of funny, when I came in, I was out in the lobby out there, there were two ladies talking, and one looked to the other and said, do you know who's speaking? And I started to step up and whip out and say hello, and the other lady says, no, but I hope he has something to say. So I looked at both of them and said, I hope he does too. So if you're out there, I hope I do all right. The school opens in 1876. It was not a smooth process to get to where they were able to open. The background story is there were private institutions, but there were no public institutions of higher learning nationwide. Lincoln decides that he will sign the act. The act had been in legislation for 10 years, through the 50s, and then on July 2nd, 1862, the day after Malvern Hill, the same day he signed the Homestead Act and about 5 other pieces of legislation, he signs a bill called the Morrill Land Grant Act. And in that act, and I do think it was different versions it was added, there was one little paragraph that says, in addition to establishing the schools of higher education, you will teach military tactics, which is fairly wide open. The problem was, it wasn't penciled in, it was already done. The day before, Robert E. Lee had just about pushed the Army of the Potomac into the river. Another few hours and he would have wiped out the Army of the Potomac, and history would have been completely different at Malvern Hill. Lincoln goes down the river on a barge, and the next day he fires McClellan and still wishes he could have hired Robert E. Lee, but Robert E. Lee decided to go another direction. The act will be passed, and it will begin to go out to all the states. This is 1862, but Texas will not act until the 1870s. One of the key items was a matching provision. Texas in their constitution had a line that says you will establish a first-class university in your state. It will become a very contentious item all the way up until today about what that university was, and because that other little school on the Colorado was not open until 3 or 4 years after Texas A&M. And that's caused a lot of concern and heartburn through the years, and I think that's a personal problem for them over there. But the fact of the matter is through the 70s, they realized they need to activate this, and the secret to activating this was to use lands that have been given to them, sell these thousands of acres of land, raise that money, and use that to build the campus. Well, Texas was a little bit different. We have no federal land in the state of Texas to this day. We have bases that have moved here, but we have no federal land. We entered as a treaty into the United States, and we could withdraw tomorrow if we wanted to. And if Texas withdrew, this would be the 14th biggest economy in the world. So there's still a chance for that too. But at that time, they said, well, if you have no federal land, what we'll do is we'll give you land in Colorado, and we'll sell that. They received the money and the proceeds of that. They put a bid out, and they began to look. The quick story is they had 5 or 6 spots ranging from Temple, Bellevue, Belton, and a deal was cut, and there's hundreds of stories about that too, with Harvey Mitchell and the boys down here at the speakeasy, the bar, the shop, the cafeteria, whatever you want to call it, in which they conveniently lost about 2,000 acres in the poker game. The money to pay for this disappears and never is accounted for. It is nowhere in the state records anywhere. As the school begins to open, they build 2 buildings. They built Old Main, in which there's a plaque over there, and Old Main stands where the academic building is today. And they build the Stewart's Hall, or Gathright Hall, which was basically everything on campus. Kitchens, dining, dorms, professors' homes, classrooms. Everything was in 2 buildings. The school will open on Monday, October the 2nd, but no one shows up because there's a confusion in the train schedule, and the governor cannot get here till Wednesday. So the official dedication is on October the 4th. That day, there are 6 students, 6 professors, pretty good teacher ratio there, 6 buildings, and 2 of them are outhouses, the governor, and a handful of observers from Bryan. Governor Koch will come over. He comes to Valley Junction and changes the train in Hearn and comes up here on the Houston, Texas Central. There were two really qualifications to locate the school. A source of water, and they declared the water was the Brazos, not the cisterns, and be on the railroad line and in a centrally located spot. And so you have the Houston, Texas Central Railroad, and what a crime to tear down the station house out there. Whoever did that, every time I go by the one in Hearn, I'm just thinking, what an absolute, who did that? So many of you are aware of that. I won't get into that, but what a shame to tear that building down. And I collect pictures of the old station. I've got a lot of them, and with cadets around it and trains, but we'll go on from that. There's those buildings, and then there's that station house out there that is being used. The 6 students will grow within a year to 200. Interestingly, there's no scholarships at A&M till the GI Bill. They wrote their own checks, they got their own job, there was work study where they worked on the farms, and they began to come to the school. The earliest days, it was wild, unsettled, raw. It was the absolute Wild West out here. Ironically enough, including the wild wolves and deer and all that stuff, I've always questioned the wolves part, but we'll call them wolves. They probably call them the coyotes wolves, but they did have longhorn steers that roamed the campus because all the way up until the freeze of 1890, longhorns roamed the entire state everywhere. You could corral them and put them in this, take them to sell and sell them. They weren't branded or anything. So ironically, and the yearbook will be named the Longhorn until 1946. Our mascot probably should have been the Longhorn. But that didn't work out that way. The Corps will begin. One of the things about the Corps, and remember this, there are 54 other land-grant schools. You got 50 states, so how can we have 54? I guess they're taken in Guam and a couple of other places. But LSU was LSU A&M. Purdue was a land-grant school, South Carolina. Mississippi State was Mississippi A&M. Our original rival was Mississippi State. That was supposed to be the Thanksgiving game, was Mississippi State. And this is not a coincidence because all the early, the President Gathright and all the early faculty, many of them came through Mississippi to come to Texas. There were GTTs, gone to Texas. Many of them were like Travis, looking over their shoulder. The only thing is they ended up at the Alamo, they ended up in College Station. The fact of the matter is they brought with them the basis of the education, except for one thing. This was supposed to be agricultural and mechanical with a side instruction in military. They brought a classical studies here. They brought all these, what basically would be a purely liberal arts type bent. And all of a sudden, very early, they got crosswise with everybody, with the Grange, the other farmers' organizations, and those wonderful people in the legislature over in Austin who kept saying, wait a minute, you're supposed to be teaching folks how to be engineers and farmers and ranchers. What's this classical stuff? You can't grow corn with classical education. So they had not yet figured out the mix on how to do that. As a result of that, there would be massive turnover, massive faculty problems throughout this first period up until 1891. And then, and they were after A&M. There were a number of attempts now with the establishment of the university in Austin to close down A&M so they can consolidate all the money to concentrate their money in one spot. So you could see that. And the other thing is the Capitol's in the shadow. The campus over there, the lobbyists and all that. And the lobbyists are alive and well. They've been here ever since forever, you know. So that was going to cause a problem. The cadets were on the 5-point plan. They had one old lady, their roommate, 2 sets of uniforms, 3 square meals a day. They had to go to 4 classes, and they had drill 5 days a week. There was nothing on campus. And they could steal some beer for Brian and bring it down the railroad tracks in kegs, and they got caught. There was all type of pranks. There was just a constant amount of stuff. They tried to go to the fair in Bryan. They were able to go down to Houston to go to the rodeo when they had some rodeos. But there is basically nothing to keep them here other than working on the farm, chopping firewood. Remember, throughout this period, there's no running water, there's no electricity, no paved roads. You chop your own firewood, and it's a pretty rough, but the enrollment continues to grow. And through the years, we'll have to add tents, we'll have to add shacks, and it goes all the way up into the barracks that were just now being torn down from World War II over to Married Student Housing area, and then of course on the other side of Kyle Field. I mean, those buildings were only supposed to last for 6 years, and they lasted for 60. And the ones in Washington, they only took down 10 years ago. I mean, there were people still occupying those same 2-story barracks. That was a kit. They delivered it on 2 rail cars. And they got the rail car, they just opened it up and dumped it out, and that kit built those 2-story barracks. You weren't supposed to have anything left over, put it in, you're done with. No air conditioning, no nothing. But the change will come in 1891. Lawrence Sullivan Ross, and this guy is the real deal. We always talk about people that are really icons or legends and whatever. But I'm working on a thing right now to where I have gone out to everywhere I could find to collect all the letters that he wrote while he was president of A&M to anybody. And I found about 30. And they are the most fascinating letters. It's like reading the newspaper today, dealing with the legislature, faculty, food service. He's got all the same problems that are going on. But the run-up for him coming here will be the change for this school. An Indian fighter, as you know, he was shot through and through with a Sharps rifle that went through and out the back between his shoulder blades. Somehow it didn't hit the heart, the aorta, or a lung. He's laying under a tree. Apparently he did not hemorrhage too bad. An Indian came up, broke an arrow in half, wrapped it up with moss and some special whatever, salve, and stuck the arrow through him to help stop bleeding, to take care of him. They were able to get him off the field and take him in, and of course he lives, because he lives to 60 years old, 1898. This is a tough dude. He fought in 108 engagements, had a half a dozen horses shot out from under him during the Civil War, and he's just an easygoing guy. He had grown up on the frontier, goes back and becomes sheriff, senator, governor. He's finished being governor, and A&M is in a real crisis. They're looking for a president. Well, I'm not sure this is the way it happened, but there was a major move taking place in the legislature to close Texas A&M down. And they were on the floor, and they called it the cancer on the Brazos. At that time, the word cancer was a 4-letter word. I mean, it was a derogatory thing to say. It's a normal word today in our daily life, but to say something was the cancer on the Brazos. Some big old boy from Texarkana was introducing. Now, Ross was about 5'6", 135 pounds, soaking wet in combat boots. He calls that big old boy out in the rotunda. They just finished a cap. He looked at him, he decked him right there on the floor, and he looks at him down there and he says, "You keep your hands off that school on the Brazos." The next week, the board of directors offered Ross the presidency of Texas A&M. Now, that's not exactly how to be president of A&M, but it was good for A&M. Because he shows up. He had sent some food over in turkeys. The cadets stole his turkeys. The house wasn't ready. I mean, everything goes wrong. But the first letter he writes to his adjutant, who had worked with him as governor, saying, "You know what? We got some rough edges over here, but I think I'm going to like it, and I think the boys are going to like me." And this begins a decade of activity. I'm not sure what exactly happened, but I think what he did is realizing they had to write this because the legislature, he had signed money to come to A&M, but they cut half of it off. He knew he had the connections. He got the agriculture, the Grange to quit. The Grange was really powerful in this state. They ran the politics. He got them to cool off, and he said, "You got to give us a chance to pull this off." And I'm not sure how he did it, but somehow it might have gone like this. He got the faculty and the cadets and some of their parents and the former students in there and said, "Folks, if we don't get our act together, we're out of here." They have all good reason to shut this down. Now, the education's got to work. We've got to add the classes. We need to get on with this. And things begin to happen. The modern traditions that we have today, the Aggie Band, the ring, the first rings were done, $9.95. What do they cost today, $1,200? More?
Mine was 36.
Mine was 36, yours was 36, mine was $82. And so the price has gone up. The Ross Volunteers will be established. There will become an identity that will follow the battalion, the school newspaper, and football will start in the 1890s in earnest. It had been a club sport, but it would move in earnest. Things begin to fall into place. Articles appeared that said, "We're sending our son to Sul Ross." They weren't sending him to Texas A&M, they were sending him to Sul Ross. And literally, they were sending him. When the train pulled up here with new freshmen, they were told by upperclassmen to walk straight to the main building, get in line, and you will be interviewed by the president of the university. And Ross would personally interview them and ask them questions like this. "Can you name 2 of the Austins that were key in the Texas history? Can you name the main rivers of the state of Texas? What is the county seat of the 3 counties around your county?" He'd ask them a math question, and if they got through most of that, he was fine. The average student was somewhere between 14 and 17 and had learned to read in McGuffey's 8th grade reader. And you had to not have a criminal record, but they didn't check that very often. Not with some of the wild guys that got here. And wild guys, also during the period, are ladies going to school. I've interviewed hundreds of Aggies. I've interviewed them from the 1800s. Now you're gonna really be thinking about this. And I'm 42 years old now, okay? Keep this in mind. The 1800s, last century, and this century. I interviewed the Hudson Twins, who were on campus the last 4 years of the century, who were the class of '03 from A&M. Mary and Sophie, one lived in Gulfport, Mississippi, and the other one lived in New Orleans. They were engineers. Their father was a history professor here, Charles Hudson. They took all the coursework to graduate. Since they didn't have the facilities to offer graduation, they were given a 4-year certificate. I don't know whether they made that, Jerry did ever straighten that out? I don't know what they did. I know the Crawford they did and others in the 20s. But Mary, and I got them on the phone. I went down there to see them, and you know, these ladies are something else. And I'm telling you what, I said, "How you been doing this, ladies?" And they pulled out a little bottle and they slid it over to me and they poured me a shot of Jack Daniels. They called it a dram. Said, son, our doctor prescribed this for medicinal purposes, that we have one of these every night. And, you know, they were big Baptist ladies and everything, and I said, I'm not touching this at all. And said, we work hard, we've had a wonderful life, but they walked me through that period. It was just fascinating. And so co-eds have attended A&M all through this period. And they will continue to attend as special students. And they were sponsors of the outfits. All the units had sponsorship from the co-eds. A couple more things here, I'll only leave some questions. The big change with Ross, it will set the school at a bedrock. The core will continue to grow. By the early 1900s, it's up to over 1,000. A&M will put graduates into the Spanish-American War. They will put them in Cuba, the Philippines. They will begin to travel. They will begin to go into the professional military schools. But again, the full mechanism to bring on officers will not happen until World War I with the ROTC that you see today. ROTC will obviously change everything. Half the alumni that are alive in 1917 serve in the U.S. military. Cushing, class of 1884, serves as a major running the transportation in France for all the trains. Quick story. He was probably already in his 50s at the time. He was a general manager of the Southern Pacific Railroad. Went down to enlist, and they said, "Oh man, get out of here." He says, "You don't seem to understand. I want to go in the Army, and I want to work." He says, "Well, you don't have the proper letter." So he picked the phone up and called the White House. Had a friend there, and they said the White House had letters that make him whatever he wants to be and give him a uniform. Said, "I want to be a major, I want to go to France." And he ran all the railroads and came back. Cushing Library, that's what that's named for. Edwin Cushing. The alumni will begin to grow. The network that will be created, that we will see today, that is the larger secret of the alumni, the friends, the families of A&M, it will really come out of the World War I period. Coming out of that period, A&M already also is put on the world stage. You've got graduates going all over the world, and also you've got research coming here. The faculty will change. The campus would grow tremendously in the 20s and 30s, and then it will just almost come to a stop in the mid-30s. Not because of the Depression, just because they maxed out their space. Roosevelt will come through here. He'd been fishing, not Teddy, Franklin. Franklin Roosevelt had been in Galveston fishing off the back of a destroyer. I don't know how you do that. The line must have had to go down about 80 feet. But like he said, you can fish, but you don't have to catch any fish. He'd sit on the back and smoke a cigar and sip on scotch and talk to his friends back there and get fresh air. And the media couldn't bother him out there. He said, "I'm surrounded by guns. Nobody's going to bother me out here." Gets off the train, and he's met by a brand new elected congressman who barely knew what he was doing from the 10th district, a kid named Lyndon Johnson. They ride the train up here and they stop up here, and this is 1938. And wants to tour the campus and goes out. So he asks the commandant and the president, "What do you need?" He said, "What do you mean? We're doing fine." He goes, "No, what do you need?" He said, "We're going to need dorms." Well, the core dorms, you know, the expansion of Sabisa, Duncan Dining Hall and all that. He says, "Why don't I do it? Elliot, call Jesse Jones and write him a check." Gave him a check for $1.9 million the next week. Roosevelt already knew then we were going to war. They had the Pan A Institute on the Yangtze River where the Japanese had bombed our ship and killed 24 people. He knew he was going to have cadets. He said, "You've got to build this cadet corps and let's expand it." Well, the one way to expand it is to have dorm space. And of course, that would be the growth and the big push of the corps. The traditions, you've got two different periods where a lot of things step in. During the slang and a lot of things the Corps used comes in World War II, and then in the 60s, the early 60s, a lot of it will change at that time. The Corps will hang on. What is happening during this period after World War II that's so significant is so many schools basically will collapse their Corps cadets. LSU basically gets rid of the Corps cadets, Clemson, Purdue, many of them because they've just moved on and they've decided not to maintain this. I think one of the interesting things that will happen is A&M makes that adjustment. Going co-ed is going to have to happen. I mean, Lyndon Johnson, You know, General Rudder spent a lot of time with Lyndon Johnson. I mean, if you don't know this, they're about this tight. And it was real simple. He would sneak out of here and go into Washington and stay in the White House a couple nights every other month. And he finally, Lyndon told him, said, General, you're gonna have the greatest school in the world, but you need to get past this co-ed thing, because we'll take care of it. He cut the deal to get the cyclotron on campus and some other stuff, but they came back and they made the transition. The name will be changed in '63 to the A&M, from the A&M College of Texas, the Texas A&M, and A&M brilliantly, I don't know who did it, keeps the A&M. We didn't go to Texas State or something else like that, like LSU did. And so a lot of coincidental things happened. The phase-in was good, it worked well. But the entire time, the basis of the core, the traditions, and another very unique thing is, it will continue to permeate the entire, you know, idea and concept of Aggies. You know this, you see it. The core clearly has had that effect and will continue to have that effect. One last thing on the war hymn. I'm right at 27 minutes. All the songs at A&M are written by Aggies for Aggies. It's not like some other school where there's somebody mailed in a thing, Miss George to get you gooey to whatever, rah, 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 you or something like that. Somebody came out with this idea that since we're going in the SEC, we have to change the verse of the war hymn. That's a good response. I knew I was not getting old, just more mature, and I said, guys, you're missing this. 4 or 5 years, we are not going to be in the SEC. This is all a big deal. They're looking for 16 teams to have a playoff. They got to figure out what to do with Notre Dame. We might be another conference. I don't care if we play in tiddlywinks. It's goodbye to Texas University, beat the hell out of University of Texas. It's very simple. But I started getting phone calls saying, oh, it's the SEC, you can't sing that song. Well, then I tell them the story about what happened. I said, well, let me tell you what happened in the fall of '75. I got in the car with a good friend of mine, John Green, and we rode over to Vernon, Texas. And Pinky Wilson, Olive, knew him quite well, Jerry, a number of you might have met him. God, what a dear old man, but he'd really been hounded by people interviewing him. And he said, I'll give you 15 minutes, son. So I get there and I spend about 2.5 hours. And I walk in the front door and he opens the front door and he goes, the chimes, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So I sit down and there's a coffee thing, a candy dish there, and he says, try that candy dish. I lift it up, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And Mrs. Wilson goes in there. She makes coffee, it's cold, makes coffee, the pot's going, da-da-da-da. I was no way I was gonna ask to go to the bathroom in that house. So when we got into the cake and coffee, I knew I was in. And he says, let me show you something. She doesn't like this. Beautiful living room. He picks up there's a table in the, what do you call this type of table? Coffee table, that's what you call it. Picks up, there's a beautiful doily or cloth over it, lifts it up and pulls out his foot locker from underneath the trunk. Oh, this is the gold mine. And he opens the trunk up, and there are his RV Whites. He was one of very few sophomores that had been led into the Ross Volunteers as a sophomore. There was only 4 or 5, and I never have figured out why. So he picks those up and then lays it on the couch. And then he pulls out the original sheet of the Aggie War Hymn. And says, here, hold it, I ought to have on white gloves or, in a sealed box or something. And we're looking at it. There's only one verse on the original War Hymn. I've written letters to the athletic people saying you got it wrong. There's only one verse, period. 1921. The original title of the song is Goodbye to Texas University. The subtitle is the Aggie War Hymn. He says, yeah, that's just like the Baptist hymnal. That's where I got the idea. But when they published it, they put the Aggie War Hymn at the top and they dropped off the Goodbye to Texas University. And there's the sheet music. I'm holding it. And he says, now here's the deal. I wrote that. It's a series of yells he put together from yells he heard before he left, before he went to the Rhine River to stand guard. He got there right at the end of the war, and he's just, standing guard. And if you've ever stood guard, you got 2 things, a lot of time and a lot of time to think. And he said, I had nothing else to think about, and he started jotting things down, so he put it together, came back and sung it a ballad. And he said, you know what? They were looking for songs then. he comes back, and they had tried a half a dozen fight songs. And they were trying to find a good fight song. And the Yale leaders heard this down at the theater and said, jazz it up, maybe we could use it. Well, they jazz it up. I think it was close to the TU game, you know, things work out well, they introduce it, everybody loves it. There's only one verse. In 1926, the Yale leaders and the student body president go back to him and say, could you write a second verse? And I think most of you have heard the singing cadets sing that, rally around the moon and white, all hail the dear old Texas Aggies. What a beautiful verse. And the singing cadets, they knock it out. It's fabulous. And he shows it to me, and he's got another piece of sheet music that has this 2 verses on it. And it's the second verse, remember that, not the first, the way it's reprinted wrong in the football program. And he says, you know what? Aggie's gonna sing what they wanna sing. And the first one, I'll bet you anything they're gonna stick with it. Well, I started getting the phone calls in the last 2 months, and I went and checked. Navy's got Beat the Hell Out of Army in their fight song. Ohio, Michigan is in it. I found 12 different fight songs that mentions another school, and they don't necessarily play those schools every year. So as far as I'm concerned, it's Beat the Hell Out of Texas and Saw Varsity's Horns off every time. That is our fight song. So going in the SEC or going into the whatever Pac-17 or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. And I think cooler heads have prevailed on that. And but it was 2 of the interviews. The Pinky Wilton interview was just awesome. The 2 ladies, Niley Smith, class of 08, Joe Ute Hall, who helped set up the Southwest Conference. They're all great Aggies. I mean, the stories and people that you know, the things you see here, I mean, I hope you capture it. You need to be on the history committee, right? There's a plug for your history committee because it really is here. And I'd like to think that the Corps of Cadets has been just a little bit part of that. And they irritate people because they block the streets when they run and do stuff. They fall asleep in classes. Sometimes they're knuckleheads. But remember, those are the ladies, I said that, and men that are in uniform, in harm's way, that are doing what they do because they love our state and our nation and Texas A&M. So that kind of neutralizes, I think, anything about you know, Aggies. And another unbelievable thing, you can go in the Corps and you don't have to go in the military. My roommate was the most conservative, redneck, gung-ho guy in the world, but he didn't want to go in the military. He said, I'll go, but it worked out to where Tom decided to go into industry and all that other stuff, which is such a great thing to have because it can perpetuate, it helps bring in the tradition, and it's voluntary, by the way. You understand, you all know that. Co-eds, I believe there's 150 in the Corps this year. So that is great. That just changes the whole complexion of what we're looking at. So with that, it's a pleasure to be here. I always love talking about the Corps of Cadets. I think we live in this is the greatest place in the world. Somebody asked me this morning meeting, I've had the good fortune to travel to some really wild and crazy places. And they said, well, what's your favorite place? And I said, right here in College Station. This is the best place in the world with the best people. And I mean, I've been in the middle of Africa and in Mongolia where I thought there were some neat places, but when it all comes down to it, I mean, we've got a community here that's tremendous. And I'd like to thank the